Hello, Jill, and welcome to Meet the Research and Meet the Researcher, our segment at NSFM Next Gen, where we are trying to learn more about research papers that have shaped the academic discussions. And yes, welcome to our YouTube video. And to start with, I would like for our viewers to learn a bit more about who is Jill, like who is the person who actually does the research.
Okay, well, nice to see you, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to do this. Well, who am I? I never really have been asked that question before as an academic. I suppose I spend most of my time doing academic work. But, I'm a nature lover. I very much am a family person. I love my family. I love spending time with them. I suppose really quite a private person, really, even though I'm quite sociable, if that helps, So never really thought about it before.
Perfect. And how did you end up in your research area? So what sparked your curiosity to do research in the area of shareholder engagement and biodiversity more recently?
Well, it goes back really to finishing my PhD, which is a very long time ago now. It was 1996 when I finished. And as you know, I started in econometrics and finance in Manchester. So I was totally embedded in, financial markets, currency exposure, all econometrics, positivist research. And right at the end of my PhD, I started getting interested in corporate governance. Mm-hmm. And I did some questionnaire work in corporate governance to investors. So my supervisor and I sent questionnaires to people in the investment community and asked them about the new codes of corporate governance, what they were doing. And the thing that really I found totally fascinating was what we call private reporting process now, mm-hmm. which actually is, as we know, shareholder engagement. I was fascinated in this new relationship which was developing between investors and companies, because if we look back into the 1990s, at that time, companies didn't want meetings with shareholders and they couldn't understand why the shareholders were asking them to meet, and they were very resistant. And that whole process took a long time to change perceptions on the corporate side about why shareholders should have the right to go and meet them and ask them questions. That whole engagement process, I actually saw it developing, and of course being interested in nature and environmental issues, myself and Aris Solomon, my researcher, and at the time my husband, we managed to get a small grant to do ethical investment research in the City of London. Yeah. Very small grant, but it was enough to go to London and actually interview these people. Yeah. So I think I was very lucky.
I think that is a great, sorry, just to interrupt you there slightly, I think that it leads greatly over to the research paper. So to the next section, Meet the Research. So you already set the scene. You basically, at the end of your PhD, that must have been quite a bit later actually, but you got the research grant to interview people in the investment process in the City of London. And what was the problem that you tried to explore at this point?
Well, if we're looking at this particular paper, because obviously this was quite a way down the research process, because I've been looking at different aspects of that relationship. But with that particular paper that we published in AOS, I was very interested in impression management in the private reporting process. So that was basically the focus of that particular paper. And I suppose my inspiration for that, I think it was around 2006, was John Roberts' paper, where he used a Foucauldian lens to look at private meetings, but he was looking more at financial information, sort of traditional financial information. And his was, I think, one of the most brilliant papers that I've read in finance. And of course, it was qualitative. So he did interviews and he talked a little bit, not about impression management exactly, but about how investors managed meetings and how companies were very scared in those meetings and they were very anxious. So that was really where the idea started. And of course, I used a different theoretical framework, but I became interested in the idea that in those meetings, the companies are managing impressions about themselves and trying to obviously give a really good picture of themselves in the meeting. So that was the beginning of the idea. And of course, the interviews showed exactly that, but a lot more as well. There's so much detail in there.
So what is impression management? Could you briefly explain that?
Well, I suppose the thing is, impression management literature in accounting is immense. So there are thousands and thousands of papers looking at impression management in written reports. And it's basically where the company is making itself look better than it probably is. It may be a misrepresentation. So impression management is usually associated with companies saying good things about themselves when actually they're misrepresenting the actual underlying reality, if that's the way we want to look at it. And there's this enormous literature, but nobody had looked at it in the private reporting sphere. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the issues for me as a researcher was trying to publish qualitative finance research basically in an accounting journal, because as we all know, finance journals tend to focus on quantitative research. So if you want to do qualitative finance research, which was really a new departure at this time, it's not easy, particularly if you want to go to a really good journal. Yeah. So the idea of private reporting was something that myself and my research collaborators came up with, to be able to put it in an accounting context, because really talking about engagement and dialogue, that's what the paper started off as a paper about impression management and engagement and dialogue. So the private reporting processes is accounting interpretation of what happens in those meetings. And it's basically saying, if you have impression management in written reports, you can also have impression management in verbal reporting, which is what it is, face-to-face communication. And that in itself is more interesting because the individual person has the potential to, use their own appearance, use their own speech, the way they speak, so many other ways of conveying communication and message than just through the written word. Which means that I think impression management is probably even more relevant to the private reporting processes.
So to just maybe mention, talk a little bit about the private reporting part. So we have basically the situation where, I think also when you conducted the research for that paper, where there is not a lot of public reporting out there on environmental, social and governance issues, which means that a lot of the investors who are interested in these issues rely almost solely on the engagement meetings, which turn these engagement meetings into reporting meetings for investors to find out issues on environment or social or governance issues which they can't get from public reporting. So that's basically the situation.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And we were just looking at social and environmental issues, particularly more on the environmental side, I think. I mean, work we'd done before that, I think it was 2006, showed that basically investors are frustrated with public reporting on environmental and social issues and ethical issues at the time. And that's not just that there isn't the information. A lot of information was starting to be reported at that time in company reporting, but it was inconsistent, it wasn't comparable, and it just wasn't in the right format. And there was a lot of information that investors were starting to see as very relevant on climate change issues, for example, carbon, pollution, all of these things, which was just not being reported properly. So in a way, they were developing these private processes as a way of making up for a lack of disclosure in corporate reporting. And that's what we were interested in looking at. And basically nobody had done anything on this. So, there were no papers, there was no research which told you what happened in these meetings. And
also because they're often behind closed doors meetings, so it's quite difficult.
Absolutely, that's right. And, I went for a job interview. I mean, you can cut this part out of the interview if you want, but I went for a job interview, and I was asked by this finance professor why on earth I was doing interviews with investors about these private meetings, because how could qualitative interview research give us any idea of what was actually happening? Yeah. And he said, how can you write about this? And I said, well, obviously, you can't get data. There's no minutes, there's no recording or transcriptions. So the only thing you can do is ask people who are at the meetings what happens in the meetings. Obviously, I didn't get that job. Because
I think that is exactly right, and it shows the importance of trying to understand the dynamics in those meetings. And I think that also brings us then to the theoretical framework of that paper and to Goffman. So why did you choose Goffman, and what does he basically tell us about how these meetings are carried out?
Well, this is the book that I read to start with. So This is the presentation of self in everyday life. Now, I suggest that anybody who's researching in accounting reads this book. I think it's an absolutely brilliant book. It basically sets a very simple idea into a very simple way of writing as well. I mean, Goffman writes in an accessible way, which is unusual for some of these theorists that we use. And that particular book, when you've read it, everything is different. You see the world in a different way. So, I mean, basically what he says, he's what's called a micro-sociologist. So he looks at interactions between two people, individuals, and he sees everything as a theatrical display. So you're interviewing me now, and I'm obviously trying to put on a performance which is going to make me look better or good or whatever. So it's all about that. It's about personal interaction,
So for example, that I didn't show up in my PJs to this interview, but I'm wearing a jacket.
Exactly right. I mean, I actually put makeup on, I washed my hair, I didn't just crawl out of bed and do this interview. And that's exactly what Goffman's talking about. So every single interaction that we have, whether it's between us talking about research, whether it's between a lecturer and a student, whether it's between a doctor and a patient, he sees it as a theatrical performance. And he was criticised for that as well by other sociologists, saying that, basically he has a really negative perception of people. But he doesn't, that's not the way that he writes about it. So he just sees people trying to obviously play a role. It's about role play. And it's also very much embedded in conceptions of reality. So, social construction of reality, which goes back to Berger and Luckman, one of the most core texts. It's how we perceive the world around us and how we try to give an impression of how we want people to see us. So it's fascinating.
And how does that now link to what's going on in the meetings? Like, what did you find from your interviews that resonated with this theoretical framework?
Well, if we think about the public reporting, so corporate reporting, then interpreting that as impression management, which of course Goffman came up with the concept of impression management, then you're looking at how reports and written reports try to give a good impression of the company. Mm-hmm. So in a private reporting process, it's much more appropriate, I think, to use Goffman's work because of his work being focused on individuals' interaction and the interaction rituals between two people or more. So in an investor meeting, the company knows that the investors are coming. It's usually held in the company premises, and therefore they have time to prepare, and they get very nervous. This comes out in the data, and it also came out of John Roberts' work. The companies get nervous ahead of the presentation. They have anxiety. They prepare answers to questions. They make lists of what they are allowed to talk about. They probably prepare a presentation. The investors, therefore, have they effectively are an audience in a staged theatrical production. And that's a Goffman-esque way of looking at things. That's, what Goffman writes about. So, you imagine the investor comes in, they sit down in the room, the investors start to ask some questions after they've had a nice little chat and maybe a coffee or whatever, and the company representatives respond. And in that process, they don't want they don't want to give the impression that they're polluting the environment. They don't want to give the impression that they're doing what Goffman calls dirty work. There are things going on that would upset environmentalists, for example, or people worrying about climate change. And obviously, if the investors see that as a risk, even if it's just a reputational risk, then, the company doesn't want to let that information out. So the way we interpreted those meetings from the data that we gathered was very much that, first of all, the investors we talked to knew that the companies put on a performance, so they expected that. And they didn't seem to mind. They weren't bothered about it, which surprised me. So what we found, and this doesn't really come out in the paper as much because of the many revisions that it went through, but what we found was that at the beginning of the interviews, they said, oh, yeah, it's fine, no problem. We're quite happy for companies to give us an impression that is probably better than reality. That's what we expect. We'd be upset if they didn't try to give us a good picture of the company. But as the interviews went on, they started to get rattled, I would say, because of the questions. So, we're asking them in a roundabout way if there was any misrepresentation. And they said, gosh, no, we never thought about that. Oh, actually, I remember in this meeting where, the company said that they had something on the website, and we went back and we knew that they hadn't got it on the website, and they put it in later, things like that. So through the interviews, it was almost taking the scales from their eyes. The investors started to realise that they were being duped quite a lot, and that actually, in some cases, they were being blatantly lied to. So that's really what the paper is about.
No, that's fascinating. And as you know, we find in our work exact same in a completely different cultural context.
Yes.
Which is why I think your paper is so powerful, because it explains things on this sociological level.
Yeah.
So if we were to think about the impact of the paper and future research, what would you say was the impact of the paper?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what I want to say, I'm not going to say in that way. But I think one of the challenges is that the better journal that you publish in, the less people outside of academia will probably read it. By the time it's in the AOS style of writing and the terrible difficulties of getting it published, actually going through 4 sets of reviews and rewriting it so that it's so complex the way that it's presented, it makes it difficult to sometimes translate that into something that practitioners would read. I mean, hopefully it's in a writing style that is accessible, but then, it's so heavily referenced, it's so theoretical. I think it's made a big impact in academia, in our area. I think it really has been used a lot. I'm surprised, really, how much it's been referenced. But it is obviously a paper which looks at things in a different way. It makes you see things in a different way. Yeah. I think that what's interesting is that since the time we did that paper, I would imagine the nature of those meetings has changed. And it would be really nice to do more work on exactly this topic to see how that's changed, because our overall feeling at the time was that the investors and the companies were creating a sort of myth, a stage play between themselves, because they knew that these issues were not as important as the financial meetings going on in the room next door. So there was a deprioritisation. We actually did another paper a few years ago where we showed that was changing, because you were getting different people in the room, more senior people being involved and being communicant with the type of environmental issues, for example, because of the nature of climate change, the way that these priorities have become more important. So I suspect that the nature of those meetings are now imbued with less impression management and actually more serious attention. And it's a matter of bringing that out through research.
And I think that brings us nicely to the next section, to the outlook, and where to go from here. So in terms of shareholder engagement, where do you see the challenges for the next generation?
Well, reflecting the work that I'm doing at the moment, and being passionate about nature and animals and birds and everything around us, I think that biodiversity issues to do with the natural world are absolutely crucial, and all the work I'm doing shows the linkages between those things and between the financial markets. So, I think that people who try to separate business, finance, accounting from nature, what they call natural capital, I say they because natural capital is one way of looking at nature and biodiversity, are completely misguided. I think that the financial system, the investment, investment institutions, banks, etc., rely completely on natural capital. I think we're only just beginning to realise those linkages. I mean, basically, we're in such a massive environmental crisis, not just with climate change, but with biodiversity collapse, that needs to be brought into everything, every aspect of the financial markets and in accounting and in banking, all of those sectors. And that's where I am working at the moment on those linkages. I'm
glad that we have a second video on this soon where we can go into exactly this in a lot more detail. So maybe just to, as a last comment, if someone would want to go the way that you went, or what would you recommend someone who's interested in shareholder engagement and would like to do research in that area? How would you recommend someone to approach this?
I suppose in the British academic system now, we do face a lot of challenges, even more now because of COVID-19. But, with early career researchers and publishing, as we all know, it is more and more challenging. And certainly the business schools are now putting a exclusive focus on 4-star publications. What I think about that, I'm not going to comment on right now. But, unfortunately, as we know in accounting, there are very, very few choices for publishing that type of qualitative work in finance. So what I would suggest to people who are interested in this area is that they look at different types of journals to start with and think seriously about this, because I hate to suggest an instrumental approach, but we have to be realistic about people's careers. So I think it's very important to maybe look at how you could theorise this type of shareholder engagement using organisational theory, for example, so that you can publish in organisation journals or management journals, business ethics journals. And I think that's one of the challenges for accounting and finance people, to look outside of the accounting journals. Of course, from an accounting journal perspective, even though we only have a small number of journals, I think it's very important to continue working on shareholder engagement and also to continue pushing qualitative finance. I think it's absolutely critical. I think quantitative finance is absolutely crucial, but I think that qualitative finance is needed as well to explore personal interactions. You can't get the type of understanding of the financial markets if you just use quantitative work. You can't understand the psychologies, the interrelationships, the way that people work together. I read a brilliant paper yesterday, one that I would have liked to write myself, about hedge funds, and it was a qualitative finance paper. They've done interviews with hedge funds, and it just opened the box of, who are these people? What do they do? How they relate to each other? That sort of thing. But it was in a management journal. Yeah. So you're now starting to see first-class qualitative research in finance published in British Journal of Management, Business Ethics Quarterly, top management and organisation and ethics journals. And I think that's very important for early career research to think about.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you very much for a great interview. Thank you.
Thank you.